Good evening and welcome, humble viewer. I am so pleased that you can join me on this relaxing journey through history once more. Please find a comfortable space. Let the noise of your world recede. Wherever you are listening from, whatever the time may be, let it be noted. A small anchor in the present, before we cast ourselves adrift into the turbulent waters of the past. We are traveling back to a moment when the world's greatest empire, the monolith that was Rome, began to show the deep and terrible cracks that would one day bring it to ruin. We are going to the dawn of the 3rd century, a time of iron and blood, to witness the birth of a story so strange, so grotesque, so utterly alien to Roman ideals, that it remains a scar on the memory of history. This is the story of an emperor who was not a general, not a statesman, not even truly a Roman, but a priest of a foreign god, a boy who would become a whirlwind of chaos and, in the eyes of his people, the worst emperor who ever lived. This is the story of Elagabalus. To understand how such a figure could ever grasp the throne of Augustus and Trajan, we must first understand the world that made him possible. We must begin not with the boy himself, but with the dynasty that preceded him, the Severans, and the crisis they had unleashed upon the Roman state. The dynasty's founder, Septimius Severus, was a different kind of emperor. A tough, ruthless military man from Leptis Magna in North Africa, he had seized power in the chaotic year of the 5 emperors and ruled with a soldier's pragmatism. He knew that the true source of imperial power no longer resided in the Senate House or with the people of Rome, but in the loyalty of the legions. His famous deathbed advice to his sons was stark and simple. Stay on good terms with each other, enrich the soldiers, and despise everyone else. It was a cynical and brutally honest assessment of the new reality. The emperor was a military dictator, and the soldiers were his constituents. But in this advice lay the seeds of destruction, for while he knew how to manage the army, his sons would prove far less adept. His 2 sons were Caracalla and Geta. They did not stay on good terms. They loathed each other with a venomous hatred that poisoned the court. After their father's death in 211, they ruled jointly in a state of paranoid armed truce. The imperial palace was physically divided between them, each brother terrified of being poisoned or assassinated by the other. This untenable situation lasted less than a year. In a move of shocking brutality, Caracalla arranged a supposed reconciliation meeting in their mother's private apartments. As Geta ran to his mother, Julia Domna, for protection, assassins sent by Caracalla burst in and cut him down in her arms, staining the empress's robes with the blood of her own son. Caracalla was now the sole ruler of the Roman world, having secured his position through fratricide. His reign was one of terror, extravagance, and military ambition. He immediately executed some 20,000 of Geta's supporters, a blood purge that cowed the city of Rome into submission. He was a man possessed by a deep insecurity, forever trying to emulate the military heroes of the past, particularly Alexander the Great. He marched his armies east, dreaming of new conquests, but his primary skill was not in strategy, but in brutality. When the city of Alexandria allegedly mocked his claims to greatness and his murder of his own brother, Caracalla responded with a massacre of breathtaking cruelty, slaughtering thousands of the city's leading citizens. Yet to the soldiers, he was a hero. He fulfilled the second part of his father's advice with gusto. He enriched them. He raised their pay by 50%, a move that bought their fierce loyalty but placed an immense and unsustainable strain on the imperial treasury. To pay for this, he debased the currency and, in his most famous act, issued the Constitutio Antoniniana in 212. This edict granted Roman citizenship to nearly all free inhabitants of the empire. While hailed by some as a great act of egalitarianism, its primary motive was fiscal. It dramatically expanded the tax base, as new citizens were now liable for inheritance taxes and other duties that previously only applied to Romans. Caracalla ruled by fear and by the adoration of the common soldier. But fear is a double-edged sword. His paranoia grew, and he saw threats everywhere. He executed senators on the flimsiest of pretexts and trusted no one. His downfall came not from the Senate or a foreign enemy, but from within his own inner circle. The man who orchestrated his demise was his Praetorian prefect, Marcus Opellius Macrinus. The Praetorian prefect was the commander of the emperor's elite bodyguard, the Praetorian Guard, and was one of the most powerful men in the empire. Macrinus was an accomplished lawyer and administrator, but he was not a senator. He was of the equestrian order, the class of knights, a capable bureaucrat who had risen through talent. According to the historian Cassius Dio, a prophet had foretold that Macrinus was destined to become emperor. When word of this prophecy reached the increasingly unstable Caracalla, Macrinus knew his life was in danger. He had to strike first. In April of 217, while Caracalla's army was on campaign near Carrhae in Mesopotamia, the same ground where Crassus had met his disastrous end centuries before, the emperor stopped his entourage to relieve himself by the side of the road, accompanied by only a few bodyguards. It was the opportunity Macrinus had been waiting for. A soldier, allegedly with a personal grievance against the emperor, rushed forward and stabbed Caracalla, killing him instantly. The assassin was cut down, but the deed was done. The bloody reign of Caracalla was over. In the ensuing confusion, Macrinus played his part perfectly, feigning ignorance and grief. With the Severan line now seemingly extinct and with the backing of the army on the scene, he convinced the soldiers to proclaim him emperor. It was a momentous and dangerous precedent. For the first time, a man who was not even a member of the Senate had seized the imperial throne. Macrinus was a capable man, but he lacked the one thing a usurper needs most: legitimacy. He had no dynastic connection to the revered Antonines or the feared Severans. He was an outsider, and he made a series of critical errors. He tried to roll back Caracalla's lavish pay raises for the soldiers, immediately alienating his most important supporters. And his most fatal mistake of all, he allowed the women of the fallen Severan dynasty to live. He did not execute them, he merely exiled them from court and sent them back to their ancestral home in Syria, believing them to be neutralized. He had no idea he was sending a nest of vipers back to their own territory, where their power, wealth, and ambition could fester and grow into a plot that would destroy him. This is where our story truly turns, moving from the political heart of the empire to its sun-scorched eastern frontier. Here, in the ancient and wealthy city of Emesa, in the Roman province of Syria, lived the formidable women who were the true architects of the rise of Elagabalus. The matriarch of this Syrian clique was Julia Maesa. She was the sister of the late Empress Julia Domna, the widow of Septimius Severus. This made her the aunt of the murdered Caracalla. Maesa was a woman of extraordinary intelligence, boundless ambition, and immense personal wealth, accumulated over decades of proximity to imperial power. She had lived at the heart of the Roman court for over 20 years, observing its mechanisms, its intrigues, and its weaknesses. She understood power in a way Macrinus never could. To be exiled by this upstart equestrian was a deep personal insult, and she was not a woman who suffered insults lightly. With Maesa in Emesa were her two daughters, both widows. The first was Julia Soaemias, a woman described by ancient sources as sensual, ambitious, and deeply devoted to the religious practices of her homeland. She was the mother of a young boy, born around the year 204, named Varius Avitus Bassianus. The second daughter was Julia Mamaea, who was by all accounts more calculating, more pragmatic, and more traditionally Roman in her outlook than her sister. She too had a young son, a cousin to Bassianus, named Alexianus, the future emperor Severus Alexander. These three women, the shrewd grandmother Maesa, the pious mother Soaemias, and the pragmatic aunt Mamaea, formed a powerful and determined triumvirate. Banished from Rome, they returned to the source of their family's power and prestige, the great temple of the sun god Elagabalus. To understand the boy who would become emperor, we must first understand the god he served. Emesa, modern-day Homs, was a major center of trade, a caravan city that sat at a crossroads of cultures. Its chief deity was not a member of the Greco-Roman pantheon. He was an ancient Semitic sun god named Elagabal, or more accurately, Elagabal, which translates to the god of the mountain. The worship of this god was ancient and deeply ingrained in the local culture. And Elagabal was not worshipped in the form of a man-like statue, as Jupiter or Apollo were. He was aniconic. His physical manifestation on Earth was a large conical black stone, a beetle, which was believed to have fallen from the sky. It was almost certainly a meteorite, a piece of the heavens itself, and was thus seen as a direct, uncorrupted embodiment of the divine. The stone was housed in a magnificent temple, which was fabulously wealthy from centuries of pious donations. The position of high priest of this powerful cult was hereditary, passed down through the generations of a single noble family, and by a quirk of fate, that family was the family of Julia Maesa. Her grandson, the young Varius Avitus Bassianus, had been born into this role. His childhood was not that of a typical Roman aristocrat. He was not trained in rhetoric, law, or military strategy. His life was the life of a priest-king of a mystery cult. From his earliest years, he would have been immersed in the temple's rituals. His days were spent not in a toga, but in lavish silks, gold-embroidered purple robes, and a high tiara studded with jewels. His world was one of incense, incantations, ecstatic music, and bloody sacrifice. The worship of Elagabalus was dramatic and sensual. The high priest would lead daily rituals, dancing around the altar of the black stone in a trance-like state, surrounded by chanting priests and the sound of pipes and drums. This was the boy's reality. He was not a Roman general in waiting. He was the living vessel for a Syrian sun god, a figure of immense spiritual authority in the East, but a complete and utter alien to the sensibilities of Rome. He was beautiful, charismatic, and by the time he was 14, he was the focal point of a daring political plot. It was Julia Maesa who saw the opportunity and crafted the strategy. She had the motive, revenge against Macrinus and the restoration of her family's power. She had the means, her vast personal fortune, and in her grandson, she had the perfect pawn. Macrinus was growing increasingly unpopular. The soldiers, stationed in Syria not far from Emesa, grumbled about their reduced pay and yearned for the largesse of the Severan dynasty. Maesa began to put her plan into motion. She started a rumor, a brilliant and potent lie that was perfectly calculated to appeal to the disaffected soldiery. She let it be known that her daughter, Julia Soaemias, had not been a faithful wife. She whispered to key commanders that Soaemias had been one of Caracalla's many lovers during his time in the East, and that her son, the handsome young priest Bassianus, was not the son of his legal father, but was in fact the illegitimate son of the murdered emperor Caracalla. This was a stroke of political genius. It instantly gave her grandson a direct, if fabricated, bloodline connection to the last Severan emperor, the man the army still revered. It transformed him from a mere Syrian priest into a rightful heir, a lost son come to claim his inheritance. To solidify the claim, the boy dropped his Syrian name, Varius Avitus Bassianus, and was rebranded with the full imperial nomenclature of his supposed father, Marcus Aurelius Antoninus. This name was a masterpiece of political marketing. Marcus Aurelius harkened back to the golden age of the Antonine dynasty, and Antoninus was the name Caracalla himself had used. It was a name steeped in legitimacy and military glory. With the story in place, Maesa deployed her greatest weapon, gold. She smuggled vast sums from her personal treasury into the camp of the Legio III Gallica, which was stationed near Emesa. She promised the soldiers a massive bonus, far more than Macrinus would ever pay them, if they would switch their allegiance to the true son of Caracalla. On the night of May 16th, 218, the plot came to fruition. Julia Maesa and her daughters, Soaemias and Mamea, secretly brought the 14-year-old boy to the military camp. He was presented to the soldiers, some say dressed in one of Caracalla's old uniforms. The legionaries, their loyalty bought with gold, and their sentiments stirred by the sight of the boy they believed to be their beloved former commander's son, hailed him as emperor. They swore an oath of fealty to Marcus Aurelius Antoninus. The rebellion was now in the open. When news reached the Emperor Macrinus at Antioch, he initially dismissed it as a minor disturbance, a pretended Antoninus. He failed to grasp the symbolic power of the Severan name and the depth of his own unpopularity. He sent a small force under his Praetorian prefect to crush the revolt, but the legionaries, faced with their former comrades and swayed by more of Maesa's gold, killed their commander and defected to the young pretender. The revolt snowballed. More legions declared for the boy emperor. Macrinus was finally forced to take the threat seriously and marched his own army, including the Praetorian Guard, to confront the rebels. The decisive battle took place near Antioch on June the 8th, 218. The fighting was fierce, and at one point Macrinus's Praetorians began to gain the upper hand, causing the rebel legions to waver. According to the historian Herodian, it was the Severan women who saved the day. As their soldiers began to flee, Julia Maesa and Julia Soaemias leapt from their chariots and ran among the retreating troops, weeping, pleading, and physically blocking their path. They shamed the soldiers for abandoning the son of Caracalla and their own chance at glory and riches. Their extraordinary courage and presence of mind rallied the troops, who turned and renewed the attack with fresh determination. Faced with this renewed onslaught and with his own authority crumbling, Macrinus lost his nerve. He abandoned the battlefield, shaving his beard and disguising himself as a courier in a desperate attempt to flee back to the safety of Rome. His flight sealed his fate. His army, leaderless and demoralized, surrendered to the forces of the new emperor. Macrinus was captured a few days later in Chalcedon, trying to cross the Bosphorus into Europe. He was executed, and his 9-year-old son, Diadumenianus, whom he had elevated to the rank of Caesar, was also hunted down and killed. The brief, ill-fated reign of the equestrian emperor was over, and so, through a masterful combination of lies, bribery, and the sheer force of will of his grandmother, a 14-year-old Syrian priest who had never seen Rome, who knew nothing of its traditions, and whose entire life had been dedicated to the worship of a black stone, was now the undisputed master of the Roman world. The Senate in Rome, faced with a fait accompli and the might of the Syrian legions, had no choice but to formally recognize him. They conferred upon him the titles of Augustus, Pater Patriae, and Pontifex Maximus. They had no idea what was coming. They believed they were getting a restored Severan, another Antoninus. They could not possibly have conceived of the reality that the new Pontifex Maximus, the chief priest of the Roman state religion, had every intention of abolishing their gods and replacing Jupiter Optimus Maximus himself with his own strange conical deity. The die was cast. A new god was coming to Rome, and a new kind of terror was about to be unleashed upon the city. The genesis of the nightmare was complete. The boy priest from Emesa had won his throne. Now the world would watch in horror as he began to rule. The victory near Antioch was total. The armies of the usurper Macrinus had been defeated, had defected, or had simply melted away into the Syrian countryside. The boy emperor, now universally hailed by the Eastern legions as Marcus Aurelius Antoninus Augustus, was the undisputed master of the Roman East. The logical, traditional, and politically essential next step for any new emperor, especially one so young and with a claim to power forged in lies and gold, was to make all haste to Rome. The city was the psychological and political center of the universe, the source of senatorial legitimacy, and the stage upon which imperial power was ultimately ratified and performed. An emperor's presence was required to calm the volatile urban populace, to reward his senatorial supporters with his gaze, to purge his enemies, and to establish the concrete machinery of his administration. To remain in the East was to project weakness, to risk being seen as a provincial ruler, a mere king of Syria, not the true master of the Roman world. It was a sign of profound insecurity, a failure to confidently step into the role of Caesar. But the new emperor did not follow this ancient and well-trodden script. He seemed to operate according to a different calendar, a different set of priorities, ones dictated not by Roman political necessity, but by the inscrutable will of his god. He was in no hurry at all. His journey to the capital would be a slow, meandering, and deeply unsettling procession, a year-long crawl across the empire that served as a rolling exhibition of his strange new world order. His first major stop was Antioch itself, the third largest city in the empire and the great metropolis of the Roman Orient. Here, in this hub of commerce, culture, and Roman administration, he began to reveal the first true flashes of his character, and it was a character that immediately unnerved the established elite. He showed little to no interest in the tedious but essential tasks of provincial governance. He did not immerse himself in military logistics, the state of the grain supply, or the petitions of local dignitaries. His focus was singular and sharp, aimed at two things: personal vengeance and religious ritual. He ordered the summary execution of the remaining key supporters of the defeated Macrinus, displaying a casual and performative cruelty that went beyond political necessity. He seemed to relish the act of retribution, but his true passion, the central organizing principle of his existence, was his God. He spent his days not in meetings with his governors and generals, but in performing the daily ecstatic rituals of Elagabalus. The citizens of Antioch, a sophisticated and cosmopolitan populace long accustomed to a diverse and often exotic array of Eastern mystery cults, were nonetheless taken aback by the public spectacle of their new emperor. This boy, this supposed heir of the great Augustus, would dance in the city's public spaces, dressed not in the sober toga or the armor of a commander, but in flowing silks and laden with jewels, leading frenzied chants to his strange conical stone which he had brought into the city. This was not how a Roman emperor was supposed to behave. The cardinal virtues of an emperor, the qualities drilled into every aristocratic Roman boy, were gravitas, a solemn, serious dignity in all public matters, and a stoic, almost detached self-control. An emperor was the firm anchor of the state. This boy priest, however, displayed neither. He was all passion, all ecstasy, all foreign fervor. He was not an anchor, he was a whirlwind. Finally, the imperial entourage began its slow journey westward. It was a procession of staggering size and complexity, a mobile city snaking its way across the provinces of Asia Minor. It comprised legions of soldiers, cohorts of courtiers and servants, a menagerie of priests and acolytes, and the emperor's powerful female relatives, Julia Maesa and Julia Soaemius. But the true center of gravity of this entire moving world, the object around which everything and everyone revolved, was not the emperor himself, but the sacred black stone. The Beetle of Elagabalus was not left behind in its ancient temple in Emesa. It was to accompany its high priest to his new home in Rome. A special chariot was constructed for it, a magnificent creation of astonishing opulence, gilded with gold and studded with precious gems. The stone was carefully placed upon this mobile shrine, and the chariot was drawn not by ordinary horses, but by a team of flawless, enormous white steeds harnessed with gold. The emperor himself would frequently lead this procession, walking backwards for miles on end, his eyes fixed in a state of rapt adoration upon the divine object. No human driver was ever permitted to sit on the chariot, and no reins were used. The god was to travel alone, guided only by the emperor's reverence. This bizarre spectacle, a Roman emperor, the commander of legions, acting as the humble stable boy to a rock on a cart, became a daily fixture of the journey. As the procession moved through the ancient cities of Cappadocia and Galatia, it was a sight that inspired a mixture of awe, confusion, and deep, creeping unease among the local populations. The onset of winter found the imperial court in the province of Bithynia, a wealthy and Hellenized region on the southern shores of the Black Sea. They chose to settle for the winter months in the city of Nicomedia, a major eastern capital and a place of great luxury and sophistication. It was here, during the long, dark and idle months of the winter of 218 to 219, far from the critical eyes and restraining influence of the Roman Senate, that the true, unvarnished nature of the new reign began to solidify and fester. Elagabalus, as we should now definitively call him, for he increasingly used the name of his god as his own, shedding the politically useful but personally meaningless name of Antoninus, established a court that was a perfect mirror of his own proclivities. He surrounded himself with his Syrian confidants, the priests of his cult, and a host of new favorites chosen not for their administrative skill or noble birth, but for their beauty or their ability to amuse him. The traditional Roman senators and equestrian officials who had joined his cause found themselves progressively sidelined, their advice ignored, their sober presence a clear annoyance to the emperor's new circle. It was in Nicomedia that he began to openly and systematically flout every Roman sexual and social norm. The historian Cassius Dio, a contemporary senator who would later serve on a council meant to advise the emperor, and who developed a deep personal loathing for him, provides a litany of scandalous details in his history. While his account is undoubtedly colored by senatorial bias, the sheer weight and specificity of the accusations paint a damning picture. He writes of the emperor's all-consuming and public infatuation with a handsome blonde charioteer from the province of Caria named Hierocles. Charioteers were the sports superstars of the Roman world, adored by the masses, but they were also legally classified as infames, people of ill repute. This category included actors, gladiators, and prostitutes. They were at the very bottom of the social hierarchy, legally barred from holding public office or marrying a Roman citizen of standing. Yet Elagabalus, the emperor of Rome, allegedly referred to the low-born Hierocles as his husband. He reveled in being dominated by the charioteer, allowing Hierocles to strike him as a sign of affection and taking pride in the bruises. He promised to elevate his lover to the rank of Caesar, a move that would have shattered the entire Roman social and political order. This was a profound and deliberate inversion of the Roman universe. The emperor was supposed to be the ultimate expression of Roman virtues, a concept of masculinity tied to martial prowess, self-control, and dominance. He was the paterfamilias, the father of the nation. For an emperor to willingly and publicly take on a passive, submissive role, especially with a socially disgraced provincial, was an attack on the very metaphysical foundations of Roman masculinity and imperial authority. It was in Nicomedia too that the stories began to circulate with greater intensity, tales of his desire to be formally addressed as empress, domina instead of emperor, dominus, his regular use of heavy makeup, wigs, and female clothing, and his inquiries to the court physicians about the possibility of being surgically given female genitalia. Whether these stories are literally true, politically motivated exaggerations, or a combination of both, they point to a fundamental and undeniable truth. Elagabalus was systematically dismantling every established Roman norm of behavior, dress, and gender identity. He was not merely ignorant of Roman tradition or indifferent to it. He seemed to be taking a gleeful, almost religious pleasure in actively desecrating it, in performing its opposite. While the emperor and his strange court dallied in Nicomedia, the city of Rome waited. For over a year, the capital had been without its supreme ruler, governed in his name by his shrewd grandmother, Julia Maesa, who had wisely traveled ahead to secure their political position. But the city was anxious. An emperor's long absence was always unsettling, a vacuum that invited conspiracy. And the rumors flowing from the east were becoming increasingly bizarre and difficult to dismiss. They painted a portrait of a ruler who was not just young and inexperienced, but fundamentally alien. The Senate, cowed but proud, tried to maintain a semblance of normality, but they were governing in a void, waiting for a ruler they had never met and were beginning to dread. It was into this atmosphere of tense anticipation that Elagabalus made a decision that would crystallize all of Rome's worst fears into a single, shocking, and unforgettable image. He decided to send his official portrait ahead of him. It was to be hung in the most sacred space of Roman politics, the Senate House, the Curia, positioned directly above the altar of the goddess Victory, where every senator swore an oath to the state. The hanging of a new emperor's portrait in the Curia was a standard and ancient tradition. It was a symbolic act of taking possession, of placing his image and authority among the great, revered figures of Roman history. The senators would have been expecting a familiar and reassuring sight. A portrait of a handsome young man in a sober toga, the official garb of a Roman citizen and statesman, or perhaps in gleaming military armor, emphasizing his role as commander-in-chief. His expression should be stern, noble, composed, embodying the imperial quality of dignitas. What they received was something else entirely. It was an act of psychological warfare. The painting that was unveiled in the Senate was a full-length depiction of their new emperor, but it portrayed him not as a Roman, but as the high priest of Emesa. He was shown standing beside the altar of his god, dressed from head to toe, not in wool or leather, but in flowing, ostentatiously effeminate silks of purple and gold. His face, as described by Herodian, was painted with rouge on his cheeks and white lead to lighten his complexion. His eyes were darkened with kohl, extended in the Eastern style. On his head was not the simple laurel wreath of a Roman conqueror, but a towering, jewel-encrusted tiara, a symbol of Oriental monarchy that was utterly despised by the Romans, who had founded their republic on the expulsion of kings. Around his neck and on his arms were heavy necklaces and bracelets of gold and pearl. He was a vision of Eastern decadence, the living embodiment of every negative stereotype the Romans held about the cultures they had conquered. To understand the depth of the shock and visceral horror this painting caused, one must first understand the very bedrock of Roman elite identity, the mos maiorum, the way of the ancestors. This was not a written constitution, but a powerful, unwritten code of conduct, a set of traditions, customs, and moral principles that had guided the Republic and the Empire for centuries. It was the source of Roman exceptionalism, the thing that made them who they were. The mos maiorum valued sobriety over excess, public duty over private pleasure, stern practicality over frivolous luxury, and a rigid, martial masculinity over any hint of effeminacy. A Roman man of the elite class was defined by his gravitas, his seriousness of purpose, and his dignitas, his public prestige earned through a lifetime of service to the state, both in the forum and on the battlefield. He wore the toga, a simple and impractical garment of white wool, precisely because it was the solemn uniform of a citizen, distinguishing him from soldiers, foreigners, and slaves. His body was supposed to be hard, disciplined, and ready for service. Luxury, fine silks, perfumes, and cosmetics were viewed with deep suspicion and contempt. They were seen as signs of Oriental weakness, of the moral corruption and softness that had brought down the great kingdoms of the East. These were the trappings of slaves, eunuchs, and despots, not of a Roman magistrate. Elagabalus's portrait was therefore not merely an eccentric or tasteless aesthetic choice. It was a political and cultural manifesto. It was a deliberate, contemptuous, and public rejection of the entire Roman value system. By ordering this image to be hung in the very heart of Roman political life, and worse, placing it directly over the sacred altar of the goddess Victory, the divine symbol of Rome's military triumph over the supposedly decadent East, he was committing an act of profound and calculated sacrilege. He was forcing the senators of Rome, the custodians of the mos maiorum, to offer incense and conduct the business of the empire under the gaze of a figure who represented everything they defined themselves against. Cassius Dio records the scene with palpable disgust. The senators, old men from families that had governed Rome for generations, looked upon this painting in stunned, horrified silence. They saw not an emperor, but a barbarian priest-king. They saw not the restorer of the Severan dynasty, but the potential destroyer of Roman civilization itself. The fear was no longer an abstract rumor from a distant province. It now had a painted face, and it was hanging over their heads. They obeyed the order, cowed by the military power his name represented, but the damage was irreparable. They now knew, with absolute certainty, that a strange and hostile power was on its way to their city. Finally, in the late summer of 219, after more than a year of this slow, portentous journey, the imperial procession at last approached the gates of Rome. The city, filled with a mixture of dread and morbid curiosity, prepared for his adventus, the formal, time-honored ceremony of an emperor's arrival. An adventus was meant to be a joyous occasion, a public holiday where the people and the Senate would officially welcome their ruler, reaffirming the bond between the city and its leader. There would be cheering crowds, sacrifices at the temples of the state gods, and the promise of games and largesse. Elagabalus's arrival, however, was unlike any the city had ever witnessed. He entered Rome in a chariot, as was tradition, but the pomp and circumstance, the entire focus of the procession, were directed not at him, but at the object that followed him, the black stone of Elagabal. The god entered Rome in a triumphal procession of its own, its magnificent chariot drawn by the team of flawless white horses, with the emperor of the known world walking before it, like a humble servant. The Roman people, the plebs, who had lined the streets for hours expecting to see their new leader and judge his bearing, were instead confronted with this bizarre religious spectacle. They saw a boy dressed in foreign silks, his face painted, his entire being consecrated to the safe passage of a conical rock. The procession did not head for the traditional imperial residences on the Palatine Hill or to the Capitoline Hill to pay homage to Jupiter Optimus Maximus, the protector of Rome, as every emperor before him had done. Its first and most urgent destination was a temporary temple that had been specially prepared to house the stone, a sacred precinct where the god could be installed and worshipped before the emperor even attended to his own personal or state affairs. The message could not have been clearer or more chilling. The new emperor was merely a herald. The true ruler who had arrived in Rome that day was the god Elagabalus. This entrance was the final, undeniable confirmation of a terrifying collision of worlds. For centuries, Rome had been the imperial center, a cultural vortex that absorbed, assimilated, and Romanized the peoples and the gods it conquered. It took foreign deities, yes, Isis from Egypt, Mithras from Persia, Cybele from Anatolia, but it gave them Latin names, Roman-style temples, and integrated them into its vast and accommodating pantheon, always under the unquestioned supremacy of Jupiter Optimus Maximus, the best and greatest, the divine guarantor of the Roman state. But this was different. This was an inversion of that process. Elagabalus was not bringing a new god to be assimilated into the Roman system. He was bringing a new system with its god at the top to supplant the Roman one. He was not a Roman emperor who happened to have a personal devotion to a Syrian deity. He was the high priest of a Syrian deity who had happened to acquire the title of Roman emperor, and he intended to use the full crushing power of that office to impose his god on a city that did not want him. The black stone was now inside the pomerium, the sacred heart of the city. The boy priest was installed in the sprawling imperial palace on the Palatine Hill, surrounded by his Syrian courtiers, his low-born favorites, and his powerful mother and grandmother. The Senate was terrified into silent obedience. The people were bewildered and deeply unsettled. And the soldiers of the Praetorian Guard, the elite, swaggering kingmakers of Rome, who had been instrumental in both the rise and fall of Macrinus, watched these developments with a growing sense of disgust and contempt. They had signed on to restore a Severan, a military dynasty that understood them and rewarded them with coin. They had not signed on to be the bodyguards of a dancing, cross-dressing priest and his foreign rock. The slow, ominous journey was over. The emperor was in his capital, but his arrival felt less like a homecoming and more like an invasion. A shadow had fallen over the 7 hills of Rome, a shadow cast by a black stone from Syria. The battle for the soul of the city was about to begin in earnest. The city of Rome was now a cage, and its new master began at once to redecorate it in the image of his own alien soul. Having arrived not as a Roman general, but as a divine herald, Elagabalus wasted no time in commencing his life's great and terrible project, the complete dismantling of the Roman religious universe and its reconstruction around a single, immovable, black stone. This was not to be a subtle integration, a gentle syncretism of the kind Rome had practiced for centuries. This was a revolution, a violent and absolute cosmic realignment, and its first physical expression was the construction of a monstrous new edifice on the most sacred ground in the city. The emperor ordered the building of a magnificent temple to house his god, a structure that would come to be known as the Elagabalus, and he chose its location with a precision of calculated insult that was breathtaking. It was to be built on the northeastern corner of the Palatine Hill, the legendary hill where Romulus had founded the city, the hill that was the residential seat of the Caesars and the very symbol of imperial power. From this commanding position, the new temple would physically loom over the ancient Roman Forum below, its shadow falling across the traditional heart of Roman civic and religious life. The construction itself was a spectacle of imperial will and lavish expense. The finest marble was requisitioned, vast quantities of gold and silver were diverted from the state treasury, and artisans from across the Eastern Empire were summoned to create a structure of purely oriental splendor. It was not built in the sober, classical style of a traditional Roman temple, with its clean lines and Corinthian columns. It was a riot of Eastern aesthetics, designed to be a worthy home for a sun god. The altar was vast, and before it, the emperor intended to perform daily sacrifices on a scale that dwarfed the normal rites of the Roman state. But the physical building, for all its opulence, was merely the shell. It was the temple's intended function that constituted the true declaration of war against Roman tradition. Elagabalus decreed that this temple was not to be just another home for another god. It was to be the new center of all worship in the empire. His goal was to transfer every single object of reverence held by the Roman people into this one single building. This was a concept so profoundly un-Roman, it was almost incomprehensible. The Roman religious landscape was a rich, complex, and geographically specific tapestry. The sanctity of a god was tied to their specific place, their temple, their ancient statue. The god Jupiter was most powerful in his great temple on the Capitoline Hill. The goddess Vesta's power resided in her eternal flame, in her small, circular temple in the Forum. The Penates, the household gods of the Roman state itself, were sacred because they resided in their own sanctuary. Elagabalus intended to rip this entire tapestry to shreds. He planned to uproot these ancient cults, to physically seize their most sacred relics, the Palladium, the ancilla shields of Mars, the eternal flame of Vesta, the very stone of the great Mother Cybele, and move them all into the Elagabalium. There, they would be arranged not as equals, but as mere attendants, as servants and courtiers in the palace of a new supreme deity. Jupiter Optimus Maximus, the best and greatest, the divine protector of the Roman people and the personification of the state, was not to be destroyed. He was to be demoted. He would become a mere planetary deity, a functionary in the celestial court of the one true Lord, the sun god, Elagabal. The emperor was not just introducing a new god, he was attempting to enslave the old ones. To inaugurate this new cosmic order, Elagabalus orchestrated a series of divine events, acts of sacrilegious pageantry so bizarre they left the Roman aristocracy reeling in visceral horror. The first was the arrangement of a sacred marriage, a hieros gamos. His god, being the new king of the heavens, required a consort. A bachelor god was incomplete. And with an impeccable instinct for sacrilege, Elagabalus chose as the first bride for his stone the most revered virgin goddess in Rome, Pallas Minerva. Minerva was not just any deity. She was a member of the archaic Capitoline triad with Jupiter and Juno. She was the goddess of wisdom, of strategic warfare, of weaving and crafts. She was a stern, intelligent, and fiercely chaste deity, the very embodiment of disciplined intellect. To the Romans, the idea of forcing this virgin goddess into a marriage, let alone a marriage to a foreign rock, was a grotesque violation, a theological beating. The emperor was unmoved by such sentiments. He staged a magnificent public procession. The ancient and sacred statue of Minerva was forcibly removed from its temple, an act that would have been unthinkable under any normal circumstances. It was placed on a litter and carried through the streets of Rome, accompanied by the entire Senate, who were compelled to march in the parade like reluctant guests at an unholy wedding. The procession ended at the Elagabalium, where a formal wedding ceremony was conducted between the statue of the Roman goddess and the conical black stone of the Syrian god. The emperor himself officiated, dancing and chanting, declaring that the marriage was a perfect union. The fierce warrior wisdom of Minerva, he proclaimed, would now be happily coupled with the generative power of his sun god. To the Romans, it was an obscene joke. He had taken their goddess of the mind and forcibly married her to a symbol of pure, irrational, foreign superstition. The union, however, did not last. After a short time, Elagabalus announced that the divine marriage was a failure. He divorced Minerva on the grounds that she was too warlike, too martial for his Pacific deity. The goddess was unceremoniously returned to her temple, now defiled by her association with the foreign cult. A new bride had to be found. This time, Elagabalus's choice was even more provocative, digging deep into the historical trauma of the Roman psyche. He decided that the perfect consort for Elagabal would be the goddess Urania of Carthage. This was not the Roman Juno Caelestis, but her Punic original, the great goddess Tanit, the chief deity of Rome's ancient and most hated enemy. The Punic Wars were not just a series of military conflicts for the Romans, they were the defining, near-apocalyptic struggle of their history. Hannibal had brought Rome to its knees, The Carthaginian gods were figures of terror and dark power. To bring a Carthaginian goddess into the heart of Rome and elevate her to the position of empress of the gods was a deliberate act of historical desecration. It was spitting on the graves of generations of Roman soldiers who had died fighting Carthage. The emperor ordered the magnificent cult statue of Urania to be brought all the way from its great temple in Carthage to Rome. When it arrived, he staged another, even more lavish wedding ceremony, and this divine marriage came with a price for the Roman people. Elagabalus declared that such a noble bride could not come to her husband empty-handed. She required a dowry. He therefore levied a special tax on the entire population of Italy, a wedding gift to the new divine couple. The people of Rome were now being forced to pay for the sacrilegious marriage of a Syrian stone to the goddess of their ancestral enemies. The union was celebrated with riotous feasts and public distributions of food, an attempt to buy the people's affection, but the underlying insult was impossible to ignore. The emperor had now positioned his god not only as the master of the Roman pantheon, but as the symbolic conqueror of Rome's old rival, absorbing her divine power into his own. With the divine household established, the daily rituals began in earnest, and they were a relentless assault on Roman sensibilities. Every morning, the emperor would perform his duties as high priest. He would emerge from the palace dressed in his customary silks, his face painted, his body adorned with jewelry. Before the great altar of the Elagabalus, a ritual of staggering excess would unfold. Hecatombs, sacrifices of 100 animals at a time, of the finest bulls and sheep were slaughtered, their blood flowing in rivers across the marble pavement and into special channels. The emperor himself, in a state of religious ecstasy, would dance around the altar to the sound of non-Roman music, the piercing wail of pipes, the clash of cymbals, and the thunder of drums. He would be surrounded by a chorus of his Syrian priests, their bodies swaying, their voices raised in chants in their native tongue. The Senate of Rome was forced to become an audience for this daily performance. The most powerful men in the empire, aristocrats and former generals, were compelled to abandon the business of the state and stand for hours in their solemn togas, watching in silent disgust as their emperor, the Pontifex Maximus, gyrated and chanted like a foreign mystic. They were made to witness the entrails of the sacrificed animals being piled high and burned, the thick, greasy smoke of an Eastern-style holocaust filling the air. Wine, unmixed and in vast quantities, would be poured as libations, flowing with the blood of the sacrifices. It was a spectacle of waste, of chaos, of a religious emotionalism that was profoundly alien to the controlled, contractual, and sober nature of traditional Roman state ritual. But the most terrifying rumors went far beyond the slaughter of animals. The ancient sources, particularly Cassius Dio and the author of the Historia Augusta, accuse Elagabalus of the ultimate transgression, human sacrifice. They claim that he secretly sought out the most beautiful and well-born children of the Italian nobility, boys with both parents still living, a traditional requirement for certain ancient Roman priesthoods. These children were allegedly sacrificed so the emperor could inspect their entrails for omens, a dark form of divination known as extispicy. The sources claim that he would perform these rites himself, using his knowledge of Eastern magic. While the charge of human sacrifice is a common trope used in antiquity to demonize a hated ruler, and it is impossible to verify, the fact that it was believed by his contemporaries speaks volumes about the atmosphere of terror he had created. In a city where the emperor was supposed to be the pater patriae, the father of the fatherland, the idea that he was now preying upon its children, using their bodies for black magic, was the culmination of all their fears. He was not just a bad emperor, he was a monster, a devourer of his own people. The entire religious life of the city was held hostage to his fanaticism. He would stage elaborate processions where he would transport the black stone from its Palatine temple to a suburban shrine, forcing the entire population to line the streets and throw flowers and herbs before the god's chariot. He scattered gold and silver coins into the crowds, a cynical gesture that brought momentary cheers but did nothing to quell the deep-seated resentment. He had fundamentally inverted the relationship between the emperor and the gods. Traditionally, the emperor, as Pontifex Maximus, was the chief servant of the gods of Rome, the intermediary who ensured their favor, pax deorum for the benefit of the state. Elagabalus had made himself the master of the gods, and the state was now forced to serve not the divine protectors of Rome, but the personal obsessions of its emperor. The foundations of Roman religion, which were inextricably linked with the foundations of the state itself, were not just being ignored or neglected, they were being systematically and gleefully torn down, stone by sacred stone, and replaced with the cult of a single, silent black rock from Syria. While the spiritual foundations of Rome were being systematically dismantled and reassembled into a grotesque new shape, the political and social structures of the empire were subjected to a parallel assault. If the Elagabalium was the physical symbol of his religious revolution, then the imperial court became the epicenter of a political earthquake, a place where every hallowed tradition of Roman governance was treated with contempt, where merit was replaced by cronyism, and where the sober business of managing a world empire was subordinated to the whims of a teenager and his unqualified favorites. Elagabalus did not just neglect the duties of a Roman emperor, he actively inverted them, turning the administration of the state into a chaotic and corrupt parody of its former self. At the heart of this political decay was his relationship with the Roman Senate. For centuries, the Senate had been the emotional and theoretical core of the Roman state. Though its real power had been vastly diminished since the days of the Republic, it remained a body of immense prestige and symbolic importance. It was the repository of tradition, the collective voice of the aristocracy, and the institution that conferred formal legitimacy upon an emperor. A wise emperor treated the Senate with respect, consulting its members, appointing them to high office, and maintaining the fiction that he was merely the princeps, the first among equals. A foolish emperor ignored it. But Elagabalus went further. He seemed dedicated to its active and repeated humiliation, as if taking a perverse pleasure in grinding the faces of these proud, elderly aristocrats into the dirt. One of his first and most shocking acts was to formally grant his mother, Julia Soaemias, a place in the Senate. This was an unprecedented and revolutionary breach of tradition. The Senate was, and had always been, an exclusively male institution. The presence of a woman, let alone the emperor's mother, seated among them as a colleague, was an unthinkable violation of the mos maiorum. Cassius Dio, as a senator himself, records the event with sputtering indignation. He describes how Soaemias would enter the curia, take a seat alongside the consuls, and participate in the drafting of decrees, her signature appearing on official documents alongside those of the most powerful men in Rome. She was given the title clarissima, the designation for a senator's wife, but also the more potent, invented title of Augusta Senatus, Empress of the Senate. This act fundamentally shattered the gendered separation of Roman political life. To the senators, it was not a progressive step towards equality. It was a profound humiliation, a sign that their sacred, masculine space had been contaminated and that they were no longer masters in their own house, but were now subject to the whims of a Syrian woman. But Elagabalus did not stop there. If the Senate itself could be feminized, then he would create a new Senate just for women. He established what the Historia Augusta calls a cenaculum, or little senate, on the Quirinal Hill. This body was presided over by his mother and was composed of the wives of the leading senators. However, its purpose was not to debate matters of state, but to legislate on the most frivolous and stereotypically feminine concerns imaginable. This women's senate would issue decrees, styled like real senatorial edicts, on matters of court etiquette, fashion, and social precedence. They would dictate which noble ladies were permitted to ride in chariots and which must use litters, what style of jewels were appropriate for each social rank, and what kind of salutations were owed between them. While this might seem almost comical, its effect was deeply insidious. It was a parody of the real Senate, a deliberate mockery that reduced the grave and serious business of Roman lawmaking to the level of society gossip. It was another way of saying to the proud men of the Roman aristocracy, your ancient institution is no more serious than a tea party. Your laws are no more important than rules about what shoes a woman can wear. This contempt for the established order was most clearly visible in his appointments to the most powerful offices of the state. Traditionally, the path to high office, the cursus honorum, was a long and arduous one. A man would serve in the army, hold a series of junior magistracies, prove his administrative and legal competence over decades, and only then might he hope to be appointed to a provincial governorship or a major prefecture. Merit, experience, and noble birth were the key criteria. Elagabalus swept this entire system aside. He treated the highest offices of the Roman Empire as personal gifts to be distributed among his lovers, his friends, and his fellow cultists, with a complete and utter disregard for their qualifications. The most egregious examples were the men who shared his bed. His husband, the Carian charioteer Heracles, a man of low birth and no administrative experience, was promised the rank of Caesar and wielded an influence greater than that of any senator. The emperor, it was said, would plead with the Senate to formally make Heracles his successor, a request they managed to deflect through terrified inaction. Another favorite was a hairdresser and former slave from Smyrna named Aurelius Zoticus. Elagabalus brought him to Rome, fell madly in love with his physique, and showered him with honors. Zoticus was given the title of Cubicularius, the emperor's chamberlain, a position of immense informal power due to his proximity to the emperor. He was also granted the honorific titles of a consul, despite having never held any public office. He was, for a brief time, the most powerful man in the palace, his opinion sought on matters of state, his influence capable of making or breaking the careers of senators. The sources gleefully report that his career came to a swift end when he failed to perform to the emperor's satisfaction in the bedchamber and was summarily stripped of all his honors and exiled from Italy. The story, whether true or not, illustrates the new reality. The fate of the empire could rise and fall on the sexual whims of its teenage ruler. Positions of real, tangible power were distributed with the same reckless abandon. The crucial post of Praetorian prefect, the commander of the emperor's bodyguard, and a position with vast judicial and military authority, was given to a man named Comazon, a former actor and dancer who had been a comrade of Elagabalus's from the eastern provinces. To make a former actor, an infamous, the commander of the proud Praetorian Guard, was an insult of the highest order to both the soldiers and the entire equestrian class from which prefects were usually drawn. Not content with this, Elagabalus also had Comazon appointed consul, the highest formal office in the Roman state, and made him the urban prefect, the governor of the city of Rome, a post he held 3 times. A man who had once danced on a stage for the amusement of the masses was now the supreme judge and administrator of the capital city of the world. This government, by cronyism, was not just about rewarding friends. It became a system of institutionalized corruption. The sale of public offices became rampant. Positions in the Senate, governorships of provinces, commands in the army, all were available for a price. The emperor's favorites acted as brokers, taking bribes to secure appointments for ambitious but unqualified men. This practice rotted the Roman administration from the inside out. Talented and experienced men were pushed aside, while the government filled up with rich sycophants who had bought their way into power. The long-term consequences were catastrophic. Provincial populations suffered under corrupt governors who sought only to recoup the cost of their bribe by extorting the locals. The military was weakened by incompetent commanders who had purchased their legions. The entire edifice of the Roman civil service, one of the empire's greatest strengths, was being systematically undermined for short-term financial gain and the amusement of the emperor. The contrast between the serious matters of state and the emperor's actual priorities was stark and terrifying to the traditional Roman elite. While the frontiers of the empire faced constant threats from Germanic tribes on the Rhine and the Danube and the rising power of the Sassanid Persians in the east, the emperor's attention was obsessively focused on his religious rituals and personal pleasures. His state meetings were often discussions about new forms of sauces for his banquets, or debates on the most aesthetically pleasing way to choreograph a procession for his god. He is said to have dispatched imperial ships not to transport grain or soldiers, but to search the coasts of Italy for a particular type of rare seafood he enjoyed. He used the formidable Roman spy network, the frumentarii, not to gather intelligence on foreign enemies, but to investigate the private lives of the Roman nobility, seeking out men with large genitals who might please him. The machinery of a world empire, an intricate system of bureaucracy, law, and military power built over centuries, was being hijacked and repurposed to serve the decadent hobbies of a single individual. This was the ultimate fulfillment of the worst Roman fears about monarchy. The Republic had been founded on the principle that no single man should have such unchecked power. The Augustan settlement had tried to mask the emperor's autocracy behind a veil of republican tradition. But under Elagabalus, the mask was not just off, it was being trampled underfoot. He ruled not as a Roman princeps, but as an oriental despot, a god-king for whom the state was not a sacred trust but a personal possession, and its people and institutions were merely tools for the gratification of his divine and personal will. The Senate sat in silent fury. The administration decayed into a corrupt marketplace, and the true business of the empire was left to drift, rudderless, in a sea of silks, blood, and wine. The court had ceased to be a center of government, it had become a theater of chaos, and its director was a mad priest-king. The decay of the Roman state under Elagabalus was not merely a matter of political corruption and religious sacrilege, it was also a performance, a relentless theatrical spectacle of decadence so profound and so bizarre that it seemed designed to shatter the very concept of reality for those forced to witness it. The primary stage for this performance was the imperial banquet. In the Roman world, the formal dinner party, or convivium, was far more than a meal. It was a crucial social and political institution. It was where alliances were cemented, hierarchies were reinforced, and power was displayed. A traditional Roman state banquet, while often luxurious, was meant to be an orderly affair, a demonstration of the host's wealth, yes, but also his generosity, his taste, and his control. Under Elagabalus, the imperial banquet was transformed into an instrument of psychological warfare, a surrealist carnival of waste and absurdity where the laws of nature and economics were gleefully suspended and the guests were not honored participants but terrified props in the emperor's private theater of the absurd. The stories of these banquets, preserved primarily in the lurid and often exaggerated accounts of the Historia Augusta, have become legendary. They paint a picture of a mind so divorced from convention that it sought to remake the world in its own strange image, starting with the food on the table. One of the emperor's most famous obsessions was with color. He would host monochromatic feasts where every single item served had to be of a single, uniform color. There were blue banquets, where guests were forced to eat dark, bruised-looking fowl, lentils dyed with indigo, and melons injected with colored water, all served on sapphire blue plates in a room draped with blue silk. There were green banquets and white banquets, each a culinary and aesthetic challenge that subordinated taste, nutrition, and tradition to a single, arbitrary, visual whim. This was not just eccentricity. It was a demonstration of absolute power. It showed that the emperor's will could override the natural color of food, that his aesthetic decree was more important than the substance of reality itself. This detachment from reality extended to the very materials of the meal. Elagabalus took a perverse delight in trickery and illusion, in blurring the line between the edible and the inedible. He would invite a group of his less favored courtiers or senators to a state dinner, seating them at the lower end of the hall. While he and his inner circle feasted on the most exquisite delicacies, the brains of peacocks and pheasants, the tongues of flamingos, the roe of rare fish, these unfortunate guests would be served a meal that was a perfect deceptive replica, made entirely of non-food items. They would be presented with beautifully sculpted chickens carved from wood, hams molded from painted clay, peas made of glass beads, and fruit sculpted from colored wax. They were forced to sit through the entire multi-hour feast, pretending to eat, surrounded by the aromas of the real food being consumed at the high table, their hunger a private humiliation made into a public spectacle. The emperor would watch them, roaring with laughter at their predicament. This was power at its most cruel, the power to offer the illusion of sustenance while enforcing starvation, to turn the fundamental act of eating into a form of torture. Even when the food was real, the circumstances of its consumption were designed to be unsettling and dangerous. The emperor loved surprise and chaos. He He is said to have trained tame lions, leopards and bears, animals normally reserved for the savage spectacles of the Colosseum, to wander among the dining couches during his feasts. These great predators, declawed and defanged but still terrifyingly large, would nose at the guests, lie down at their feet, and create an undercurrent of primal fear throughout the meal. A diner could never fully relax, never be sure of his safety, forced to make polite conversation while a leopard sniffed at his leg. This was another projection of the emperor's worldview, that there is no safety, no order, that the chaotic and the wild can be unleashed at any moment, even in the heart of the imperial palace. He combined this love of chaos with a flair for cruel comedy. During one feast, he had his servants collect all the shoes of his sleeping, drunken guests and bring them to him. He then had a pack of dogs, specially starved for the occasion, unleashed into the dining hall to fight over the leather shoes, creating a terrifying scene of snarling animals and waking his guests to a state of pure panic. In another instance of bizarre generosity, he would hold public lotteries during his feasts. But the prizes were wildly, almost sadistically, mismatched. One lottery ticket might grant a man £10 of gold. The next might grant him 10 dead flies. One ticket could award a dozen prize stallions, another a dozen lame frogs. The lots were drawn, and the emperor would watch with delight as one man received a fortune and the man next to him received a container of worms. It was a perfect metaphor for his style of governance, a world where fortune and ruin were distributed entirely at random, with no reference to merit, justice, or reason. But the most iconic, the most enduringly famous story of his extravagance is the tale of the suffocating flowers. It is the defining image of his reign, a story that encapsulates his unique blend of aestheticism, waste, and casual disregard for human life. The Historia Augusta tells of a private banquet held in a special reversible dining room. As the feast progressed and the guests grew more intoxicated, Elagabalus gave a signal. From panels in the ceiling, a gentle shower of flower petals began to drift down upon the diners, violets and roses, the most prized flowers of the Roman world. At first, it must have seemed like a moment of unparalleled beauty and luxury, a fragrant, colorful storm of blossoms. But the shower did not stop. The gentle drift became a deluge, a suffocating torrent of petals that began to pile up around the guests. The air grew thick with their scent. Soon the diners were buried up to their knees, then their waists. Those who were too drunk or too slow to react found themselves trapped, unable to stand, their mouths and noses filled with petals. They were literally drowned, asphyxiated under a mountain of flowers. The emperor, watching from his elevated couch, is said to have found the sight exquisitely beautiful, a perfect death, a sublime fusion of fragrance, color, and mortality. Whether this event happened exactly as described is a matter of historical debate. It may be a wildly exaggerated moral tale, but its symbolic power is undeniable. It represents the ultimate conclusion of his philosophy, that beauty and luxury, when taken to their absolute extreme, become deadly. It is the image of an emperor so obsessed with sensory experience that he is willing to sacrifice human lives for a fleeting aesthetic effect. The story has haunted the imagination of artists for centuries, most famously captured in the 19th century painting by Lawrence Alma Tadema, The Roses of Elagabalus. The painting depicts a scene of languid, almost bored decadence, the emperor looking on with a placid expression as his guests flounder and disappear beneath a pink tide of blossoms. It perfectly captures the spirit of the reign, a beautiful, fragrant, and deadly apathy. This philosophy of excess was not confined to his dinner parties. It permeated every aspect of his life. He was said to never wear the same pair of shoes twice, and never to wear a ring that he had worn before. He refused to wear clothing made from linen or wool, the traditional Roman fabrics, because they were too common. He would only dress in the purest, most expensive Chinese silk, often embroidered with gold. He bathed only in pools scented with the most expensive perfumes like saffron or balsam. He would fill his private fish ponds not with ordinary fish, but with water that had been perfumed with rose oil. He allegedly powered the lamps in his palace with balsam, an incredibly expensive aromatic resin, filling the imperial residence with a constant, cloying scent of exotic incense. He even applied this principle of extravagant waste to matters of state. When he decided to stage a mock naval battle, a naumachia, in the Circus Maximus, he did not fill the arena with ordinary water. He had it filled with wine, staging the battle on a vast man-made lake of undiluted Falernian, one of the most prized vintages in the Roman world, sacrificing a fortune in tribute revenue for a single afternoon's entertainment. This was not just spending, it was a form of anti-economics. It was a deliberate, almost gleeful destruction of value. It was a way of demonstrating that he, the emperor, stood above the mundane concerns of cost and supply. He could turn a precious commodity into a disposable spectacle simply because he could. This relentless pursuit of novelty and sensation, this equation of waste with power, was the ultimate rejection of the Roman virtue of frugalitas, the traditional ideal of moderation and thrift. A good Roman was supposed to be a careful steward of his resources, whether personal or public. Elagabalus acted like a child who had been given the keys to the world's largest treasury and had decided to set it all on fire, simply to watch it burn. His feasts were not acts of hospitality. They were acts of nihilism. They were designed to exhaust reality itself, to push the boundaries of sensory experience until they broke. For the Roman aristocracy forced to attend these events, it must have felt like living in a madman's dream, a world governed by an emperor who was not just cruel or incompetent, but who had declared war on reason itself and who wielded the infinite resources of the Roman Empire as his personal palette for creating a masterpiece of beautiful, fragrant, and deadly nonsense. Beyond the desecration of his ancestral gods and the systemic corruption of his state, it was the intimate conduct of Elagabalus, the very nature of his physical body and the desires it pursued, that provoked the most visceral and enduring horror among the Roman elite. The emperor's personal life was not and could never be a private affair. It was a relentless public performance that struck at the foundational pillars of Roman identity, systematically dismantling every cherished ideal of masculinity, sexual propriety, and gender that had underpinned their civilization for a millennium. To truly comprehend the depth of the scandal, to feel the seismic shock that his behavior sent through the Senate and the streets of Rome, one must first descend into the rigid, unforgiving, and deeply anxious world of Roman masculinity itself. The ideal Roman man, and most especially an emperor, was expected to be the living embodiment of virtues. This powerful concept was not merely virtue in a gentle, moral sense. It was a term of profound force, rooted in the Latin word vir, meaning man. It signified martial courage, physical toughness, emotional restraint, gravitas, unwavering self-control, and, above all else, absolute sexual dominance. A Roman man of the elite class was defined by his activity, his agency, and his penetration. In the complex landscape of Roman sexuality, the key distinction was not between homosexual and heterosexual desire, a binary that would have been alien to them. Instead, it was a brutal and simple hierarchy of power, the active versus the passive, the dominant versus the submissive, the penetrator versus the one who is penetrated. It was perfectly acceptable, even expected, for a man of status to have sexual relations with a wide variety of partners. His wife for procreation, female slaves for pleasure, courtesans for entertainment, and even handsome young male slaves or freeborn youths of a lower status. The crucial, non-negotiable condition was that he must always be the active, dominant partner. To willingly allow oneself to be penetrated, to take on the passive sexual role, was to be utterly feminized. It was to become a synoeidus, a term of profound contempt, a man who had abdicated his masculine essence. It was to lose one's virtues, to become an object of derision rather than a subject of power. For an emperor, the ultimate vir, the father of the nation, pater patriae, to embrace such a role was not merely a personal failing, it was a cosmic catastrophe, a public declaration of the empire's own degradation. It was against this stark, unyielding backdrop of expectation that Elagabalus painted his own, radically different and terrifyingly vivid portrait of an emperor. His formal relationships, the marriages that were supposed to provide the state with stability and heirs, became a chaotic and sacrilegious farce. In the short 4-year span of his reign, he was officially married 5 times, a dizzying succession of unions and divorces that made a mockery of the Roman institution of marriage, which, for the aristocracy, was a sacred contract intended to merge lineages, transfer property, and produce legitimate children to carry on the family name. Elagabalus treated marriage as another form of shocking performance art. His wives were a collection of pawns in his game, victims of his whims and, in one case, a co-conspirator in his grand blasphemy. His first wife was a young woman of impeccable noble birth, Julia Cornelia Paula. For a brief, flickering moment, Rome might have breathed a sigh of relief. The marriage in 219 was celebrated with incredible pomp and largesse. The emperor seemed to be playing the part, settling down with a respectable Roman aristocrat. Perhaps the strange Syrian priest could be domesticated after all. The wedding was a spectacle of public spending, with lavish games and distributions of food to the people, but the performance of normality was short-lived. Less than a year later, Elagabalus abruptly divorced her. The official reason given was a grotesque and public insult. He claimed to have discovered a blemish on her body. This was a cruel fiction, a flimsy pretext to discard a woman he had grown tired of. He stripped her of the title of Augusta and all imperial honors and sent her back to her family in disgrace. The act was a slap in the face to the Roman nobility, a demonstration that even their most well-born daughters were disposable playthings for the emperor. Having cast aside the symbol of Roman nobility, he then turned his attention to a figure who represented the ultimate Roman taboo, a woman whose purity and sanctity were believed to be mystically intertwined with the very survival and fortuna of Rome itself, a Vestal virgin. The Vestals were the 6 priestesses of Vesta, the ancient goddess of the hearth, home, and family. Chosen in childhood from the most prestigious patrician families, they took a sacred, unbreakable 30-year vow of absolute chastity. Their solemn duty was to tend the eternal flame within the circular temple of Vesta in the heart of the Roman Forum, a flame that was believed to have been brought from Troy by Aeneas and which could never be allowed to go out. The physical integrity of the Vestals was symbolically linked to the integrity of the city walls. A Vestal who broke her vow of virginity was guilty of incestum, a crime of religious pollution that was seen not as a private sin, but as a treasonous act against the state, one that would bring the wrath of the gods down upon all of Rome. The punishment was one of the most horrific in the Roman legal code. The guilty Vestal was taken to a subterranean chamber near the Colline Gate, provided with a small amount of food, water, and a single lamp, and then sealed inside, to be buried alive in the earth she had defiled. Her male partner in the crime was taken to the public square and flogged to death. This was the woman Elagabalus selected for his second wife, the Vestal virgin Aquilia Severa. The city reacted with a collective gasp of horror. He had her forcibly removed from the hallowed and cloistered house of the Vestals and publicly declared his intention to marry her. He defended this act of supreme and calculated sacrilege with a twisted theological logic that left the Senate speechless with rage and fear. He, the high priest of the sun god Elagabal, he proclaimed with grand solemnity, was marrying the high priestess of Vesta. It was not a vulgar, lustful act, but a holy union, a divine marriage between 2 of the most powerful spiritual forces in the cosmos. From this sacred coupling, he announced to the world, godlike children would be born. To the Romans, this was not a holy union. It was a theological rape, a spiritual cataclysm. He was taking the city's most sacred symbol of purity and violently yoking it to his debased foreign cult. By marrying a Vestal, he had, in a symbolic sense, extinguished the sacred flame himself. He was actively courting the destruction of Rome for the sake of a personal, blasphemous whim. The marriage was a profound and lasting trauma for the city's elite, a definitive sign that nothing was sacred, that their emperor was not their protector, but their chief defiler. Whispers of evil omens and impending doom spread throughout the city. This unholy union, like his first marriage, did not last. Perhaps the sacrilege proved less thrilling once achieved. He divorced Aquilia Severa and, in a brief and chaotic period, married 2 other women. The first, Annia Aurelia Faustina was a highly respected noblewoman and a descendant of the revered emperor Marcus Aurelius. This was a transparently political move, a cynical and short-lived attempt to graft his own tainted lineage onto one of the most respected in Roman history. He quickly tired of her and divorced her as well, before reportedly marrying and divorcing another woman whose name has been lost to history. His marital career was a whirlwind of chaos, demonstrating an attention span as short as his respect for tradition was non-existent. And then, in a final act of circular absurdity, he returned to his original transgression. He remarried the disgraced Vestal Virgin, Aquilia Severa, bringing her back to the palace. This final act proved that his initial impulse had not been a fleeting fancy, but a deep-seated obsession, a recurring desire to return to the site of his greatest sacrilege. His marriages were not a search for a partner or a political alliance. They were a chaotic dance of blasphemy, each union chosen for its maximum shock value and its power to violate Roman tradition. If his formal marriages were an assault on Roman institutions, it was his relationships with men that constituted the most profound and unforgivable assault on the Roman concept of the emperor himself. He did not merely take male lovers. Emperors from Augustus to Trajan had done so without major scandal. He fundamentally inverted the acceptable power dynamic, a transgression for which Roman society had no tolerance. He openly, joyously, and performatively celebrated his own sexual passivity. His primary and most famous relationship was with the charioteer Heracles, a handsome blonde man from the province of Caria. To understand the scandal, one must understand the status of a charioteer. They were the mega celebrities of the Roman world, their fame and adoration comparable to modern global sports stars. The chariot races in the Circus Maximus were the empire's greatest passion, and the top drivers were idolized by the masses. But legally and socially, they were infames, people of ill repute, on par with actors, gladiators, and prostitutes. They were seen as little more than glorified slaves, existing for public entertainment. For the emperor to take a lover from this disgraced class was shocking enough, but for him to publicly submit to this man was a rupture in the fabric of reality. The relationship was not hidden in the private chambers of the palace, it was paraded before the entire court. Elagabalus delighted in being publicly called the wife, the queen, and the mistress of Heracles. He would stage elaborate scenes where he played the role of a blushing, submissive bride, allowing the charioteer to treat him as his property. The historian Cassius Dio, a horrified eyewitness, reports that the emperor of the Roman world, the master of legions, would take pride in the bruises Heracles gave him, showing them off as tokens of his lover's masculine power. Dio further claims that Elagabalus would stand at the thresholds of rooms in the palace, wiggling his hips, fluttering his eyelashes, and using the lisping, affected baby talk of a prostitute to solicit his husband. This was not just sexual deviance in Roman eyes, it was a complete and utter abdication of imperial dignity, a public performance of the very antithesis of virtus. It was a voluntary self-emasculation on the world stage. Another famous favorite was a man from Smyrna named Aurelius Zoticus. A well-built athlete whose father was a cook, Zoticus was brought to the emperor's attention because he was rumored to be exceptionally well endowed. Elagabalus had him brought to Rome with great ceremony, fell into a state of immediate infatuation, and showered him with honors. Zoticus was made the emperor's chamberlain, cubicularius, a position of immense informal power due to his constant proximity to the emperor's person. He was given honorific titles far above his station and, for a brief, heady period, was arguably the most powerful man in the palace, his influence capable of making or breaking the careers of senators. The ancient sources, however, report his downfall with gleeful contempt. When the time came for the emperor to consummate his passion, Zoticus, allegedly drugged by a jealous Hierocles, was unable to perform. In a fit of rage, the emperor had him immediately stripped of all his titles, honors, and wealth, and summarily exiled from Italy. The story, whether literally true or not, perfectly illustrates the new logic of the imperial court. The highest affairs of state, the rise and fall of powerful men, could be decided not by merit or service, but by the erectile success or failure of a court favorite in the emperor's bedchamber. This obsessive desire to embody a female role was relentless and all-encompassing, extending far beyond his sexual relationships. It was a total performance of a new identity. The ancient sources are unanimous and specific in their descriptions of his appearance. He ordered his servants to pluck every hair from his body, a practice Romans strongly associated with effeminate Eastern priests and male prostitutes, synaidae. A smooth body was a body that had been prepared for sexual penetration, a clear and unambiguous signal of passivity. He wore heavy makeup daily, painting his eyes with kohl and dusting his cheeks with rouge, a practice that was, for Roman men, the ultimate sign of unmanly vanity. He utterly abandoned the traditional Roman male attire. The toga, the heavy woolen symbol of Roman citizenship and public life, was discarded as coarse and ugly. He would only dress in the finest and most expensive Chinese silk, a material seen by traditionalists as decadent, transparent, and scandalously effeminate. He wore elaborate wigs, often styled after those worn by his mother and grandmother, and adorned himself with a profusion of jewelry, necklaces, bracelets, and rings that Roman men were expected to shun. His quest to transform his body was, according to the sources, not merely cosmetic. He is said to have made serious inquiries with the court physicians, offering a vast fortune and the highest honors to any surgeon who could successfully perform a sex change operation on him, specifically requesting the creation of a functional vagina. This desire, so far outside the realm of Roman medical or social possibility, represents the absolute zenith of his rejection of his assigned body and role. He was not content to merely play the part of a woman. He yearned to become one, to physically alter his male form into a female one. The culmination of this behavior, the single act that became the most infamous and damning accusation against him, a story repeated with disgust for centuries, was the claim that he turned the imperial palace on the Palatine Hill, the sacred Domus Augusta, into a public brothel, with himself as the main attraction. The Historia Augusta describes how he would set aside a specific room in the palace, furnishing it to look like a common tavern brothel. There, he would stand naked in the doorway, his body depilated and adorned with a simple gold chain, and solicit passers-by from among the palace staff and visitors. He would allegedly adopt the lispy, affected voice of a prostitute, playfully haggling over the price of his services. He was said to have kept a tally of his clients and to have boasted to his friends that he had earned more money and taken more men than any professional prostitute in the city. He reportedly staged elaborate live-action reenactments of famous mythological scenes involving female sexuality and divine rape, such as the story of Leda and the Swan, always casting himself in the female lead role. Whether these lurid stories are literally true, and they are almost certainly exaggerated for maximum defamatory effect, is almost beside the point. Their power to persuade, and their repetition by multiple sources, reveals the core of the Roman horror. The emperor, the sacred center of their world, had not only abandoned his masculinity, he had commodified his own imperial body. He had taken the person of the Augustus, a vessel of divine authority and the property of the Roman people, and turned it into an object of public sexual commerce. He was not just an emperor who frequented brothels, he had become the brothel itself. It is impossible to fully understand this behavior without considering it through the lens of his religious fanaticism. His actions, while appearing as pure sexual perversion to the Romans, align closely with the ritual practices of certain ancient Eastern cults. In the worship of powerful mother goddesses like the Phrygian Cybele, priests engaged in ritual transvestism and ecstatic gender-bending performances. The most famous of these were the Galli, the eunuch priests of Cybele who, during a frenzied annual festival known as the Dies Sanguinis, the Day of Blood, would work themselves into a trance and surgically castrate themselves with a shard of pottery, offering their severed organs to the goddess. For the rest of their lives, they would live as a third gender, wearing female clothing, growing their hair long, and engaging in ecstatic worship. Elagabalus was deeply familiar with these traditions. The cult of Cybele had a major temple on the Palatine Hill itself. His behavior, the cross-dressing, the effeminacy, the desire for a reconstructed body, the ecstatic dancing, can be interpreted as a grand, syncretic religious act. He may have seen his adoption of a female persona not as a sexual perversion, but as a supreme act of religious devotion, a way to shed his limited earthly masculinity in order to more fully embody the receptive, fertile, and all-encompassing power of the divine. He was, in his own mind, perhaps becoming a living vessel for his god, a divine conduit, and this sacred transformation required the ritualistic destruction of his conventional male identity. But for the Romans, this theological context was a distinction without a difference. They did not see a holy priest engaged in a mystical transformation. They saw a pervert. They did not see a religious visionary. They saw a debased madman who was a disgrace to his office, his gender, and his species. The intent did not matter, the performance was all. And the performance was a monstrous, public, and relentless rejection of everything they held sacred about being Roman and about being a man. He had polluted the office of Augustus with the practices of the brothel and the rites of the castrated Eastern priest. The body of the emperor was supposed to be the symbol of the strength, integrity, and dominance of the state. The body of Elagabalus had become a symbol of its complete and utter degradation. The reign of Elagabalus was a firestorm, a chaotic and brilliant blaze of sacrilege and excess that consumed every tradition it touched. But a fire so intense cannot burn forever. By the year 221, after 3 years of this relentless assault on Roman identity, the foundations of his power, which had always been more fragile than they appeared, began to crack. The Roman world had been pushed too far. The silent, horrified fury of the Senate was beginning to coalesce into whispered conspiracies. The common people of Rome, at first bewildered and occasionally bought off with largesse, were now openly hostile, disgusted by the emperor's blasphemies and his flaunting of every Roman virtue. But the most dangerous threat came not from the Senate or the streets, but from within the imperial palace itself, and from the very woman who had orchestrated his rise to power, his own grandmother, the shrewd and formidable Julia Maesa. Julia Maesa was the master strategist, the architect of the Severan Restoration. She had gambled everything on her grandson, using her wealth and her cunning to place him on the throne. But her goal had always been the preservation and advancement of her dynasty, not the imposition of a bizarre new religion. She was a pragmatist, a woman who understood the realities of Roman power. She had likely underestimated the depth of her grandson's religious fanaticism, believing that once he was in Rome, he could be controlled, molded into a more conventional ruler. She was wrong. She had unleashed a force she could not contain. As she watched him systematically alienate every faction in the city, the Senate with his contempt, the people with his sacrilege, and most critically, the army with his effeminate behavior and neglect, she realized with the cold clarity of a born survivor that her first grandson was not an asset. He was a catastrophic liability. He was not securing the dynasty. He was steering it towards an iceberg, and he was doing it with a smile on his face and a flower in his hair. Her creation was going to destroy them all. A new strategy was needed, a course correction. If her first grandson was a failure, then she would simply have to replace him with her other one. Her second grandson was a boy named Bassianus Alexianus, the son of her other, more sober-minded daughter, Julia Mamaea. In stark contrast to his cousin, Alexianus was being raised to be the perfect Roman aristocrat. Under the careful guidance of his mother and grandmother, his education was a model of tradition. He was tutored in Latin and Greek rhetoric, in Roman law, in history, and in military theory. He was presented as a paragon of virtue, modest, respectful of his elders, pious in a conventional Roman way, and physically active, skilled in wrestling and riding. He was, in every respect, the anti-Elagabalus. Where Elagabalus was effeminate, Alexianus was presented as masculine. Where Elagabalus was a flamboyant priest, Alexianus was a sober statesman in training. Where Elagabalus worshipped a foreign stone, Alexianus paid proper reverence to Jupiter and the gods of Rome. He was the antidote, the perfect candidate to win back the hearts and minds of the Roman establishment. Julia Maesa now began the most delicate and dangerous political maneuver of her life. to undermine her own ruling grandson and elevate his cousin in his place, all without openly declaring war within the family. She began a subtle but persistent campaign of persuasion, working on Elagabalus himself. She likely argued that his divine duties as high priest were too consuming, that he needed help with the mundane earthly tasks of governance. The empire needed a Caesar, a junior emperor, to handle the tiresome business of the military and the state, freeing up the Augustus to focus on his much more important spiritual work. She flattered his ego, presenting the idea not as a check on his power, but as an enhancement of his divine status. At the same time, she began working behind the scenes, using her vast network of contacts and her still considerable wealth to promote Alexianus to key figures in the Senate and, most importantly, within the Praetorian Guard. She presented the boy to the soldiers as a true Severan, a worthy successor who embodied the martial virtues of his great-uncle Septimius Severus and his supposed great-grandfather Caracalla. Under this relentless pressure from his grandmother, and perhaps not fully grasping the trap being laid for him, Elagabalus eventually acquiesced. In the summer of 221, he formally adopted his younger cousin as his son and heir. Alexianus's name was changed to Marcus Aurelius Severus Alexander, a name carefully curated for maximum political impact. Marcus Aurelius connected him to the golden age of the Antonines. Severus solidified his claim to the ruling dynasty, and Alexander was a deliberately heroic name, evoking the image of Alexander the Great, a conqueror and a true soldier's general. The adoption was made official in a public ceremony. Elagabalus, now officially the father of Severus Alexander, was just 17 years old. His new son was 13. The immediate effect of this was the very opposite of what Elagabalus might have hoped. The adoption did not shore up his own popularity, it decimated it. The Roman world now had a clear and attractive alternative. The Senate, the people, and the army could now openly praise and show affection for the young Caesar, Severus Alexander, under the guise of loyalty to the imperial house. It was a safe form of protest. Every cheer for Alexander was an implicit condemnation of Elagabalus. Alexander, carefully managed by his mother and grandmother, played his part to perfection. He would appear in public in the simple toga of a Roman citizen, behaving with quiet dignity. He frequented the public baths without a large retinue. He was seen training with the soldiers, showing an interest in military matters. He became the living embodiment of everything the Romans missed and craved in an emperor. It did not take long for Elagabalus, for all his otherworldly obsessions, to realize what was happening. He saw the growing popularity of his cousin and the shifting allegiances within the court. He saw the way the Praetorian guardsmen would look at Alexander with respect, while their eyes held nothing but contempt for him. A deep, paranoid jealousy began to consume him. He had created his own rival, and he now understood too late that the adoption had been a terrible mistake. He began a clumsy and transparent campaign to reverse his decision. First, he tried to sideline Alexander, keeping him from public view and spreading malicious rumors about his health. When this failed to diminish his cousin's popularity, his efforts grew more desperate and more sinister. He regretted the adoption and sought to strip Alexander of his titles and annul the entire process. This move provoked a swift and terrifying backlash from the one group that truly mattered, the Praetorian Guard. The soldiers, whose loyalty had been carefully cultivated by Julia Maesa and Julia Mamaea with promises and gold, saw the attack on Alexander as an attack on their chosen future emperor. They began to mutiny, refusing their duties until Elagabalus appeared before them in person alongside Alexander to reaffirm the boy's status. A terrified Elagabalus was forced to comply. He and his cousin were carried to the Praetorian camp, where the emperor was subjected to a humiliating dressing down by his own soldiers. They demanded that he dismiss his corrupt and effeminate court favorites, his husbands and partners in debauchery, and return to a more traditional Roman way of life. They issued a chilling warning. They would protect the life of the young Caesar Alexander, and any harm that came to him would be met with their full fury. Elagabalus was now a prisoner of his own guards. He was forced to dismiss some of his most notorious companions, though he kept his beloved Heracles close. But the humiliation festered. His jealousy turned into a murderous rage. He could not tolerate the existence of this virtuous, popular boy who was a living rebuke to his entire reign. He made several attempts to have Alexander assassinated. According to the ancient sources, he first tried to have him killed by sending agents to his residence, but the plot was discovered and thwarted by the guards loyal to Alexander and his mother. Undeterred, Elagabalus tried a more direct approach. During a meeting of the Senate, he ordered his personal guards to arrest Alexander, likely with the intention of executing him on the spot. But the senators themselves, in a rare display of collective courage, rose up in protest, causing a commotion that allowed Alexander's protectors to whisk him away to the safety of the Praetorian barracks. Each failed attempt only served to increase Alexander's popularity and to seal Elagabalus's own doom. He had proven himself to be not just a blasphemer and a deviant, but a kinslayer in waiting, willing to murder a child to protect his own corrupt power. The final desperate gamble came in early March of 222. Elagabalus, in a fit of pique, started a false rumor that his cousin Alexander was on the verge of death. His hope was to test the reaction of the soldiers and the public. The reaction was immediate and catastrophic. Believing that their beloved Caesar had been murdered on the emperor's orders, the soldiers of the Praetorian Guard erupted in open revolt. They refused to believe the official denials and demanded that both Elagabalus and Alexander be brought before them at once in their camp, so they could see with their own eyes that Alexander was safe. The trap had closed. Julia Macer's brilliant, ruthless game was reaching its checkmate. She had successfully positioned her favored grandson as the champion of the army and a symbol of Roman tradition. She had maneuvered her other grandson, the reigning emperor, into a position of absolute isolation, hated by all and protected by none. The final confrontation was now inevitable. Elagabalus, accompanied by his terrified mother, Julia Soaemias, had no choice but to obey the summons of his own soldiers. He entered the Praetorian camp, the place that was supposed to be the ultimate bastion of his security, knowing that he was walking into the lion's den. The shadow of his young cousin, the boy he had been forced to make his son, had now grown so large it was about to eclipse him entirely. The unraveling was complete. All that remained was the final bloody reckoning. The Praetorian camp on the northeastern edge of Rome was more than just a military barracks. It was a city within a city, a fortress of power, and the deadliest political institution in the Roman world. Its towering brick walls and stern gatehouses were a constant, visible reminder to the Senate and the people of where true authority resided. It was here, within this cauldron of military might, that emperors were made with boisterous acclamations and unmade with the silent, efficient thrust of a sword. The soldiers garrisoned within, the elite Praetorian Guard, were not common legionaries from the frontiers. They were a privileged, swaggering corps, largely recruited from Italy, who enjoyed double the pay, shorter terms of service, and a proximity to power that bred a dangerous corporate arrogance. They were the emperor's bodyguard, his ceremonial escort, and all too often his executioners. They had murdered Caligula, orchestrated the rise of Claudius, and bought the throne for Didius Julianus. Their loyalty was the bedrock of an emperor's life, and their contempt was a death sentence. It was into this den of hardened, politically savvy, and profoundly disgusted soldiers that Elagabalus, now just 18 years of age, was forced to make his final, fateful journey on a cold, grim day in early March of 222. He arrived not as a commander reviewing his adoring troops, but as a suspect being brought in for a final, fatal judgment. He entered the gates not in a gilded chariot, but likely in a closed litter, a desperate attempt to shield himself from the hatred in the eyes of his own guards. He was accompanied by his mother, Julia Soaemias, a woman whose fierce ambition had once soared as high as her son's, a woman who had stood on a battlefield to rally troops in his name, but who now faced the grim, terrifying reality of his catastrophic failure. As their entourage passed into the vast training yard of the camp, they were met with a reception that was more terrifying than open violence, a wall of sullen, contemptuous silence. The soldiers stood in disciplined ranks, their hands resting on the pommels of their swords, their faces masks of stone-cold fury. This was the welcome for their Augustus. Moments later, a second procession entered the camp. It was the 13-year-old Caesar, Severus Alexander, arriving with his own mother, the steely and triumphant Julia Mamaea. The atmosphere transformed in an instant. The silence was shattered by a deafening roar of genuine acclamation. The Praetorians erupted in thunderous, heartfelt cheers, hailing Alexander as their true leader, their hope, the restorer of Roman honor. They raised their standards. They brandished their swords, not in threat, but in a joyous, militant salute. The contrast was a public and humiliating verdict, a meticulously staged piece of political theatre designed to leave no doubt as to the outcome of the day's proceedings. On one side stood the hated, effeminate, blaspheming emperor and his mother. On the other, the virtuous, traditionally Roman boy prince and his respectable mother. The choice had been made. The final moments, as recorded by the historians Cassius Dio and Herodian, descended into a maelstrom of chaos and butchery. The soldiers loyal to Alexander, emboldened by their numbers and the clear mood of the day, began to taunt and jostle the few guards who had remained in Elagabalus's personal retinue, men chosen for their beauty or their sycophancy rather than their military prowess. Insults about their master's perversions turned to shoves. Shoves turned to the unmistakable rasp of swords being drawn from their scabbards. A brawl erupted, a chaotic explosion of violence that quickly escalated into a one-sided slaughter as the vast majority of the Praetorians turned on the emperor's few remaining defenders, cutting them down where they stood. Seeing the violence erupt around him, Elagabalus panicked. All pretense of divine composure evaporated, revealing the terrified teenager beneath the silken robes. He, the living incarnation of the sun god, the master of the world, turned and fled, seeking any refuge he could find. He was found moments later, cowering in a camp latrine, or by another account, stuffed inside a large storage chest, a pathetic and ignominious end for a self-proclaimed deity. The soldiers dragged him out from his hiding place, his fine silks now stained with filth. He was brought before the mob, weeping and pleading for his life. It was at this moment that his mother, Julia Soaemias, in a final futile act of maternal instinct, ran to him, throwing her arms around her son in a desperate attempt to shield his body with her own. She clung to him, screaming at the soldiers, reminding them of their oaths. It was a useless gesture. The enraged Praetorians, their bloodlust up, were beyond reason or mercy. They fell upon them both in a frenzy of steel. The mob of soldiers descended, a whirlwind of swords and daggers, hacking and stabbing, their individual blows merging into a single collective act of murder. The sun god and his mother died together, their bodies collapsing into a bloody heap on the dusty parade ground of the barracks that was supposed to guarantee their safety. But their death was not the end. It was not enough to simply extinguish their lives. The accumulated hatred of the past 4 years demanded a post-mortem desecration, a quasi-religious ritual of purification through the utter humiliation of the corpses. The state had been polluted, and now it had to be violently cleansed. What followed was a gruesome spectacle of mob justice, an act of savage political exorcism. The heads of Elagabalus and his mother were severed from their bodies. The soldiers mounted them on the points of their spears, raising these ghastly trophies aloft for all to see, parading them around the camp to the roaring approval of their comrades. Then, the real procession began. The naked, mutilated corpses were tied with ropes. The soldiers began to drag them from the Praetorian camp, out through the gates and into the city of Rome. The city that had been forced to witness the emperor's bizarre religious processions, with their flower-strewn streets and chanted hymns to a black stone, now witnessed this final, horrific parade. The news of the emperor's death spread like wildfire. The citizens of Rome, who had lived in a state of cowed silence and impotent disgust, now poured out of their workshops and apartment blocks to join the mob. They cheered, they jeered, they hurled stones and rotten vegetables and refuse at the lifeless, bouncing bodies of their former rulers. It was a citywide catharsis of collective rage, an entire populace vomiting out the poison that had infected its body politic for 4 excruciating years. The root of the desecration was itself symbolic. The soldiers dragged the emperor's corpse first to the Circus Maximus, the colossal arena that had been the site of his most extravagant and bizarre spectacles. They hauled the mangled body around the sandy track where he had once raced chariots and staged mock naval battles in lakes of wine. The message was clear. The stage for your obscene theatre is now the stage for your ultimate humiliation. From the circus, the mob, swelling in size and fury, dragged the corpse through the Roman Forum, the ancient political and religious heart of the city, past the temples he had sought to subordinate and the Senate house he had so thoroughly debased. Their ultimate destination was the Tiber River. The initial intent, according to the historian Dio, was to dispose of the body in the most contemptuous way imaginable, by stuffing it into the Cloaca Maxima, Rome's great sewer. The Cloaca Maxima was more than just a drain. It was a feat of engineering and a symbol of Roman civilization, the system that carried the city's filth away, keeping it clean and healthy. To consign the emperor's body to this subterranean river of excrement was the ultimate act of defilement, a legal and symbolic declaration that he himself was nothing more than human waste, the filth to be purged from the city. The grimly ironic detail reported in the sources is that the soldiers tried to force the corpse down a sewer opening, but its size, perhaps bloated or simply the awkwardness of a dead weight, made it impossible. The emperor who had lived a life of such excess was, even in death, too much for the sewer to swallow. Thwarted in this first attempt at abject humiliation, the mob dragged the mangled body to the Pons Aemilius, one of the ancient stone bridges crossing the Tiber. There, with a final collective curse, they hurled the corpse into the muddy, swirling waters. His mother's body was disposed of with less ceremony, her final resting place unrecorded, likely left to rot in some forgotten ditch. The act of throwing a body into the Tiber was deeply significant. For the Romans, proper burial was a sacred duty, essential for ensuring that the spirit of the deceased, the manes, could find peace in the afterlife. To be denied a burial was a horrific fate, condemning the soul to wander restlessly for eternity. By casting Elagabalus into the river, the soldiers were not just disposing of a body, they were performing a spiritual execution, damning his soul just as they had destroyed his life. The emperor, who had named himself after a god, who had believed himself to be a divine being, was denied even the most basic human right. His final resting place, the polluted riverbed, destined to be swept out to sea and consumed by the creatures of the deep. The boy who had once walked backwards in reverence of a stone now floated face down towards an anonymous oblivion. With the physical body of the emperor destroyed, the machinery of the state began the official, legal process of wiping his memory from existence. The Senate, which had lived in abject terror of him for 4 years, now sprang into action with a vengeful and sycophantic enthusiasm. They immediately and joyfully proclaimed the young Severus Alexander as the new Augustus. Then they passed a formal decree of damnatio memoriae against his predecessor. This damnation of memory was one of the most severe and profound punishments the Roman state could inflict. It was a declaration that the condemned individual was so heinous, so antithetical to Roman values, that they must be considered to have never existed. It was a state-sanctioned, systematic effort to erase a person from history. The process was meticulous and empire-wide. Elagabalus's name was to be chiseled off every public inscription. On the great arch of Septimius Severus in the Forum, the space where his name had been carved was gouged out, leaving a conspicuous and ugly scar. On milestone markers from Britain to Mesopotamia, stonemasons were dispatched to erase the offensive letters. His statues, which had been erected across the empire, were to be torn down, their heads smashed or, in a more economical move, recut into the likeness of the new, virtuous emperor, Alexander. The vast quantity of coins bearing his image and titles were to be recalled and melted down, the precious metal purified and restruck with a more acceptable face. His religious edicts were formally rescinded. The very name he had used, Marcus Aurelius Antoninus, a name he had adopted to link himself to a golden age, was officially declared cursed, and it was forbidden for any future Roman to bear it. He was to be known to history only by the name of his god, Elagabalus, a permanent mark of his foreignness and his shame. The Elagabalium, his great temple on the Palatine Hill, the monument to his hubris, was formally rededicated to Jupiter Ultor, Jupiter the Avenger, a pointed and public statement of the restoration of the traditional divine order, and the black stone of Amasa, the conical beetle that had been the cause of it all, the silent, dark heart of his reign, was unceremoniously packed into a crate and shipped back to its temple in Syria. Its brief, catastrophic reign as the supreme god of Rome was over. The state was attempting to do the impossible, to surgically remove 4 years from its own history, to treat the reign of Elagabalus as a collective, feverish nightmare from which they had finally, violently awakened. And so we are left with the final haunting question. What is the true legacy of this boy emperor, this priest king, this whirlwind of chaos? How should history remember the figure who was so hated that an empire conspired to erase him? Was he truly the monster depicted with such relish by the hostile senatorial historians, a human incarnation of pure evil, sadism, and perversion? Or was he something far more complex, a figure whose reality is buried under layers of propaganda and misunderstanding? The argument for him being a genuine religious fanatic is compelling. He was not a cynic who used religion for political gain. His devotion was passionate, sincere, and all-consuming. His attempt to create a universal solar religion, with his god at its apex, was not an entirely alien concept in the 3rd century Roman world. The trend towards solar monotheism, the belief in a single supreme sun god, was a powerful undercurrent of the age, one that would find a more successful champion later in the century with the Emperor Aurelian and his state-sponsored cult of Sol Invictus, the unconquered sun. Elagabalus can be seen not as a madman, but as a radical and premature visionary, a true believer whose methods were too alien, too fast, and too contemptuous of Roman tradition to ever succeed. He did not try to Romanize his god, he tried to Emesanize Rome, and the city's immune system violently rejected the transplant. Alternatively, can we see him as a confused and traumatized teenager, a boy who was raised not as a Roman but as the living god of a mystery cult, and who was then thrust at the age of 14 into a position of absolute, unimaginable power? His bizarre behavior, the obsessive rituals, the sexual experimentation, the rejection of his assigned identity, could be interpreted as the desperate and distorted actions of a young man struggling to forge an identity under the crushing weight of expectation and cultural dislocation. He was a pawn in his grandmother's game, a boy whose entire life had been a performance. Perhaps his reign was simply the final, catastrophic performance of a child who never learned the difference between the stage and the state. From a modern perspective, it is impossible not to view him through the lens of gender identity. His documented desire to be called empress, his adoption of female clothing and cosmetics, his inquiries into sex reassignment surgery, and his embrace of a passive sexual role all point to a profound and deeply felt disconnect with the male identity he was assigned at birth. While it is anachronistic to apply the term transgender directly, his life represents one of history's most vivid and high-profile examples of pre-modern gender nonconformity. To the Romans, this was perversion of the highest order. To us, it can be seen as a tragic story of a person whose internal reality was fundamentally at odds with the rigid, unforgiving gender norms of their society, a struggle that, under the magnifying glass of absolute power, exploded into a public spectacle of deviance. Ultimately, however, the most historically robust interpretation is that Elagabalus was less a cause of crisis and more a dramatic symptom of it. The crisis of the 3rd century was a period of profound military, political, and economic instability. The old Augustan system, a delicate balance of power between the emperor, the senate, and the army, was breaking down. The army had become the sole arbiter of power. The provinces were gaining influence over the Italian center, and the very definition of what it meant to be Roman was in flux. Elagabalus, a provincial Syrian priest placed on the throne by military force, who ruled with contempt for the Senate and traditional Roman identity, was the living embodiment of all these destabilizing trends. He was not the sickness itself, but its most lurid and unforgettable fever dream. His legacy is therefore a mosaic of all these possibilities. He was a sincere fanatic, a confused teenager, a gender non-conforming individual, and a symptom of imperial decay, all at once. The damnatio memoriae failed utterly. In their attempt to erase him, the Romans ensured his immortality. The very gaps on the inscriptions, the smashed faces on the statues, the horrified whispers in the histories, they all scream his name. He is not remembered for the battles he won, for he won none. He is not remembered for the monuments he built, for they were rededicated. He is remembered for the sheer, breathtaking, multi-dimensional strangeness of his existence. He was a brief, violent, and incandescent flash in the long twilight of the Roman world, a reign so profoundly bizarre that it remains a benchmark for bad emperorship, a story of what can happen when absolute power falls into the hands of someone who worships a god, and a reality all their own. And so our journey ends. We leave the spectral emperor to his restless sleep in the silt of the Tiber, and we return to our own time, to the quiet hum of the world you left behind. The story of Elagabalus is more than just a lurid chapter from a history book. It is a unsettling reminder of the profound fragility of civilizations, a testament to how quickly the sacred can become profane, and how an entire empire, for a few short, feverish years, can be held captive by the singular obsessions of one incomprehensible mind. It is a story that asks us to look into the abyss of the past and question what we see. Do we see a monster or a martyr? A madman or a mystic? A tyrant or a tragedy? Perhaps the only certain answer is that we see a mirror reflecting the eternal human struggle between tradition and revolution, identity and expectation, order and the terrifying, beautiful and destructive allure of chaos. Look at the clock on your wall. Note the time. The minutes that have passed have been a bridge to a forgotten world. The story is over, but the echo remains. Thank you for listening, and good night.